The laughter started before the engine even stopped. Sophie heard it first, a rattling, sputtering growl cutting through the string quartet's final notes, and felt her stomach drop before she even turned around. 300 guests in the Kensington Hotel's marble courtyard turned with her, and for one suspended second, nobody breathed. Then the motorcycle rolled to a stop at the base of the grand staircase, black smoke curling off its exhaust, and Ethan climbed off in a rented tux with a scratched helmet tucked under one arm. The silence broke into laughter so fast it felt rehearsed. "Oh my God," someone whispered behind a champagne flute, not quietly enough. Sophie's twin sister, Renee, didn't bother whispering at all. "This is what she's settling for," she said to the bridesmaid beside her, loud enough to carry across the marble. Sophie's face burned as 200 pairs of eyes swept from the motorcycle to her groom, to her own stricken expression, cataloging every detail to gossip about for months. Somewhere near the back, a photographer, hired for the wedding, not for this, lowered his camera and actually laughed out loud. Ethan didn't flinch. He set the helmet down on the motorcycle seat, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the aisle like he hadn't heard a single word of it. Sophie's hands were shaking by the time he reached her. "You don't have to pretend this doesn't bother you," she whispered. He looked at her, calm, steady, unreadable, and said only, "It doesn't." She wanted to believe him, but something in the stillness of his face told her there was a version of today only he understood. Nobody at that wedding knew Ethan owned a single thing worth more than the motorcycle rusting under him. For 8 months, that had been exactly the point. Sophie had met him at a coffee shop near her father's office, a quiet man in second-hand jackets who never once let slip what he did for a living beyond "I work in tech," nothing exciting. He paid for dinners in cash, counted out carefully, folded 20s smoothed flat from being handled too many times. He ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and split it without embarrassment. He drove the motorcycle because, he told her, it was all I need, and she'd believed him completely, because nothing in the way he lived suggested otherwise. Her father, a real estate developer with 3 golf memberships and opinions about everyone his daughters dated, had made his feelings about Ethan clear from the very first meeting. A man his age with no car, no house, riding around like a delivery driver, he'd said over Thanksgiving dinner, not lowering his voice for Ethan sitting 3 seats away, carving his turkey like the comment hadn't landed at all. Sophie's mother had tried to soften it. "He seems like a nice enough boy," in a tone that made nice enough unlike a diagnosis. Sophie hadn't cared. She'd fallen for the way Ethan listened, really listened, to everything she said. The way he remembered small details other men forgot. The name of her childhood dog, the anniversary of her grandmother's death, the fact that she took her coffee black only on days she was nervous. He carried a quiet confidence that never once curdled into arrogance, no matter how many times her family made their disapproval known. And when her father needled him about his job, his apartment, his lack of ambition, Ethan simply absorbed it and kept eating, unbothered, like a man who'd weathered far worse and found it didn't cost him anything to let it pass. What she didn't know was that every dinner, every dismissive comment from her father, every eye roll from Renee, was being filed away by a man who had learned, the hard way, years ago, exactly how fast people's warmth evaporated the moment money entered the room. 2 relationships before Sophie had ended the same way. Warm, easy, promising, right up until the day his bank statements or his real job title slipped into view. And then suddenly he wasn't quite as interesting anymore. Suddenly there were reasons things weren't working. Suddenly the women who'd sworn they didn't care about money found urgent, unrelated reasons to leave. He'd sworn he would never let that happen to him again. Not without knowing, first, Who would stay when there was nothing to stay for? What he hadn't planned for was the deal closing 3 weeks before the wedding, and the press office that had strict instructions to announce it the moment the paperwork cleared, with no idea a wedding was even happening. The night Ethan decided to propose, he sat outside Sophie's apartment on the motorcycle for 20 minutes before he found the courage to go in. It wasn't nerves about her answer. It was something heavier, the weight of a decision he'd been circling for months, ever since the lawyers at Nexus AI had started drafting the paperwork for the state's largest infrastructure contract, a deal that was about to make his name impossible to hide anymore. Once the deal closed, once his face was in the papers, the test would be over whether he wanted it to be or not. He'd built Nexus from a garage 6 years ago, grown it into a company now valued past $2 billion, and done all of it without a single public photo, without ever confirming his identity to anyone outside his closest circle. Anonymity had been a choice, then a habit, then a shield. The only way he'd ever found to know if someone loved the man or the number attached to him. Sophie had never once asked him for money, never hinted, never pushed, never seemed to notice or care that dinners were modest and gifts were small. When he told her he wanted to marry her, she'd cried, not because of what he could give her, but because, she said, "You make me feel like enough, exactly as I am." He'd almost told her everything that night. He almost did. Instead, he asked her to marry him on the motorcycle, in the rain, with no ring bigger than what a man in second-hand jackets could plausibly afford. And she said yes, before he'd even finished the question. He didn't tell her the wedding date would land 3 weeks after the deal closed. He didn't tell her because, until that morning, even he didn't know exactly how loud the announcement was going to be. By the time the officiant called for the vows, half the guests were still recovering from the motorcycle, and it showed. Sophie could hear it in the murmurs threading through the rows, her father's business partners exchanging looks, someone's aunt fanning herself dramatically, as if the sputtering engine had personally offended her. Renee sat in the front row, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone attending a funeral rather than her sister's wedding. "Do you, Sophie, take this man?" the officiant began, and a phone buzzed somewhere in the third row, then another, then a ripple of buzzing moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Sophie tried to ignore it. Ethan's hand was steady in hers, his eyes fixed only on her, giving no sign he noticed the phones lighting up across the courtyard one after another. But her father noticed. Sophie watched his face change from the corner of her eye. Confusion, then something sharper, as he pulled his own phone from his jacket pocket mid-ceremony. An act so uncharacteristically rude that Sophie nearly stopped the vows to ask what was wrong. He didn't look up again for the rest of the ceremony. His face had gone the color of the marble beneath them. "I do," Sophie said, and squeezed Ethan's hand, unaware that behind her, an entire courtyard of phones was quietly loading the same breaking headline, one that had absolutely nothing to do with a wedding, and everything to do with the man standing at the altar. The alert had gone out at 4:47 p.m., timed by a press office that had no idea it was interrupting a wedding. Nexus AI founder revealed, reclusive CEO behind state's largest infrastructure deal, named for the first time. Beneath the headline, a photo, grainy, clearly taken without his knowledge, but unmistakably him, showed a man in a rumpled jacket walking out of a downtown office building. The caption named him, Ethan Alden Reyes, net worth, per the article's early estimate, north of $2 billion. A subheading beneath it read, "Company behind the contract has never publicly confirmed its founder's identity. Until today." Sophie's father read it twice before he understood what he was looking at. His thumb hovered over the screen like he expected the words to rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. Then he looked up, past his daughter and her new husband, toward the motorcycle still parked at the bottom of the staircase. Black smoke long since faded into the evening air, and something in his expression cracked open. Disbelief first, then a slow, dawning horror at his own memory of every word he'd said at that Thanksgiving table. Renee saw her father's face and leaned over to see his screen, phone in one hand, champagne forgotten in the other. She scanned the headline once, then the photo, then back to the headline, and within 30 seconds, her mocking expression from an hour earlier had drained into something closer to panic. Her mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. "That's him," she whispered. Finally, barely audible. "That's Dad. That's him. That's the guy from the motorcycle." Around them, the same thing was happening in miniature at every table. A phone buzzing, a guest frowning at the screen, a whispered, "Wait, is that?" passed to a neighbor, then confirmed, then passed again. Word moved through the reception like fire through dry grass. Guest to guest, phone to phone, the earlier laughter curdling into something closer to disbelief. Until by the time Sophie and Ethan turned to face the applauding crowd as newlyweds, half the room was no longer looking at them with pity. They were looking at Ethan like they'd just realized they'd been standing next to a landmine the entire ceremony, and it hadn't gone off yet, and every one of them was frantically trying to remember exactly what they'd said about him within earshot. Sophie's father reached them before the receiving line even formed, champagne glass abandoned somewhere behind him, color rushing back into his face in the wrong direction entirely. "Ethan," he said, voice pitched somewhere between disbelief and desperate warmth. "Son, I had no idea. Why didn't you say something? We could have arranged the venue differently. The car. I know people who—" "You knew everything you needed to know," Ethan said quietly, and something in his tone made her father's outstretched hand falter midair. "You knew I loved your daughter. You decided that wasn't enough." The words landed hard enough that nearby guests visibly stopped pretending not to listen. Sophie watched her father's face cycle through several expressions before settling on something like shame, and for the first time since she'd introduced Ethan to her family, she saw the power dynamic in the room reverse entirely. Not because Ethan had raised his voice, but because he hadn't needed to. "I'm not angry," Ethan continued. And Sophie realized this was true. There was no triumph in his voice, only tiredness, the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 8 months bracing for exactly this reaction and finding it exactly as predictable as he'd feared. "I just needed to know who my daughter would be marrying into before any of this mattered." Her father opened his mouth, found nothing adequate to say, and closed it again. Behind him, Renee had gone very quiet, staring at the motorcycle at the bottom of the stairs like it had personally betrayed her. Renee found Sophie alone near the gift table 20 minutes later, her earlier mockery nowhere in her voice now. "Did you know?" she asked. "This whole time, did you know what he was?" "No," Sophie said honestly. "I knew who he was. I just didn't know what he had." Renee flinched at the distinction, and Sophie understood, watching her sister's face, that Renee had spent the last hour running back through every comment she'd made that afternoon, every whispered joke about the motorcycle, every eye roll about the delivery driver marrying into the family, replaying it now with a horror she couldn't quite hide. "I said things," Renee started. "You did," Sophie agreed, and didn't soften it. "I didn't mean, you meant every word when you said them," Sophie said. "You just didn't expect there to be a cost." Renee had no answer for that. She stood there in her bridesmaid dress, twisting the stem of an untouched champagne glass, looking for the first time in Sophie's memory genuinely unsure of herself. Across the courtyard, Ethan was quietly declining a business card from one of their father's partners. His expression polite but distant, the same expression he'd worn through every uncomfortable family dinner for the last 8 months. Except now, Everyone in the room was finally seeing what Sophie had seen from the beginning. A man entirely unmoved by what people thought he was worth. Renee watched him a moment longer, then turned back to Sophie with a different question forming behind her eyes. One Sophie could tell, from the way her sister's jaw tightened, she wasn't sure she wanted answered. "How many of the people at this wedding do you think already knew?" Renee asked quietly, "and didn't say a word to either of us?" Sophie didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to find out how many faces in that courtyard had been performing surprise. Sophie found him near the staircase as the sun dropped low over the courtyard, one hand resting on the motorcycle's worn seat, like it was something he wasn't ready to let go of yet. Up close she could see the scratches along the tank, the cracked leather of the seat, the small dent near the handlebar he'd never explained. She'd ridden on the back of this exact bike a dozen times without ever once wondering what it was hiding. "You could have told me," she said, standing beside him. "I could have," Ethan agreed, not looking up. "But if I had, you'd have spent the last 8 months wondering whether you loved me or the number attached to my name. Every gift I gave you, every plan we made, some part of you would have been quietly doing math. I needed you to answer that question, without knowing there was one to answer." Sophie absorbed that in silence, watching the last of the guests drift toward their cars, the earlier laughter now replaced by a kind of cautious, embarrassed distance. Nobody quite sure how to behave around a man they'd mocked 3 hours earlier, whispering apologies to each other instead of to him. "And the bike?" she asked. "Is that part of the test too?" "No," Ethan said, and for the first time all day something in his voice caught. "My father drove one just like it. Before he died, before any of this," he gestured vaguely at the hotel, the guests, the life now unraveling into headlines around them, "existed. We didn't have much. He worked 2 jobs and still made time to teach me how to change the oil in a garage that didn't have real heating. I kept the bike because it's the only thing in my life that's never once changed how anyone treated me. Until today, when people finally found a reason to look past it and see something else entirely." Sophie reached for his hand, feeling for the first time the full weight of what he'd carried alone for 8 months. Not deception, she realized, but a kind of quiet, exhausting hope. Hope that someone might finally love the man on the bike, before ever learning what waited at the end of the driveway. "You didn't have to test me," she said quietly. "I know," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "But after everything, I didn't know how else to be sure. I'm sorry it cost you today. I'm not sorry I did it." Sophie thought about that for a long moment, about all the small choices she'd made without ever knowing they were being watched, the modest dinners she'd never once complained about, the ring she'd loved simply because he'd chosen it, and found, to her own quiet relief, that she wasn't angry either. "I'm glad you did it too," she said. "I just wish I could have watched your face while you waited to find out." The band, unsure whether to keep playing through the chaos, had gone quiet somewhere around the 4th headline alert, and Ethan was the one who finally told them to start again. "Play something," he said. "It's still our wedding." Sophie laughed, the first real laugh since the motorcycle had sputtered up the driveway, and pulled him onto the dance floor before either of them could second-guess it. Slowly, hesitantly, other guests followed, the earlier mockery dissolving into something more careful, more curious. Guests now watching Ethan not with pity, but with a kind of nervous fascination they didn't quite know how to disguise. Her father approached once more during the first dance, and this time he didn't reach for Ethan's hand. He simply said quietly, "I was wrong about you," and walked away before he had to see whether Ethan would accept the apology. Ethan didn't need him to. He kept his eyes on Sophie, spinning her slowly under the string lights that had, hours earlier, illuminated the worst humiliation of her life, and now lit something that finally felt like relief. Everyone staring, Sophie murmured against his shoulder. Let them, Ethan said, echoing, without realizing it, exactly what he'd told her at the very beginning of the ceremony. They were staring an hour ago too. At least this time, it's not because they're laughing. Renee watched from the edge of the dance floor, still holding her untouched champagne, and for the first time all day, said absolutely nothing at all. 6 months later, the motorcycle still sat in the garage of the house Ethan and Sophie bought together. Not the mansion the tabloids had expected, but a modest place with a wide porch and enough room for the bike to have its own corner. Sophie asked him once why he never sold it, now that a fleet of cars sat in the driveway beside it. Because it's the only thing that never lied to anyone, Ethan said. Everyone who looked down on it told me exactly who they were before I ever had to guess. Her father had softened in the months since the wedding, though softened carefully, the way people do when they're aware they're being watched for signs of sincerity. Renee, to everyone's quiet surprise, had started asking Ethan real questions about his work, instead of performing interest for an audience. Questions Sophie suspected came from genuine curiosity now, not calculation. Sophie thought back often to that moment at the altar, the sputtering engine, the laughter that had felt, in the moment, like the worst thing that could happen to her on her wedding day. She understood now that it had been the opposite, the moment that stripped away every pretense in that courtyard and showed her exactly who was standing beside her, and exactly who wasn't worth keeping around. On quiet evenings, Ethan still rode the motorcycle down the coastal road alone, helmet scratched, engine rattling the same way it always had. Not because he needed to remember who he'd become, but because he never wanted to forget who had loved him before anyone knew. Sophie never asked him to stop riding it. Some nights, watching the taillight disappear down the dark road, she found herself hoping, quietly, selfishly, that he never would.